Good evening and happy Women's History Month. I'm so excited to be here tonight. Welcome to Season 6, Episode 2 of the Young, Gifted, and Green Agenda podcast. You'll see some new faces tonight. I'm Cecile with Environmental Defense Fund, stepping in for Kayla. And we're so grateful for our partners at Young, Gifted, and Green and Climate Action Campaign for bringing us here tonight. So let's get right into it. So tonight's episode of the Green Agenda, we're going to dive into the complexities of the Toxic Substance Control Act. Some folks call it TSCA. We'll examine the current challenges, how we all play a role in defending these crucial health protections, and how this piece of legislation protects our health. We've got an amazing guest tonight. Her name is Suhani Chitalia. She's with EDF, and we'll explore the implications of public health and environmental policy and safety. And we'll also discuss effective strategies that grassroots activists and communities can employ to advocate for stronger protections against toxic chemicals. So let's get started. Suhani, you ready?
Yeah, thanks.
All right. So tell us a little bit about yourself. Who are you? What's your role? And what led you to this path in environment and advocating for frontline communities?
Yeah, so I'm Suhani. I'm with the Environmental Defense Fund. I work in our federal affairs shop. So I do our government relations work around like a number of items. So toxics and chemicals is one of them. I also do some of our energy transition work, and then also stuff around the Clean Air Act and like toxics in the clean air space. How I came into this role dates kind of way back to high school. I took a AP Environmental Science class. Shout out to Ms. Sondak. Yes. And it was the most transformative class I've taken. We took a really great trip out to the Karen E. Noonan Center, and it was through a kind of Bay NGO that our high school partnered with. And we were really lucky to have these resources to be able to do that. But we learned about how the environment impacts people. And during this season, we worked particularly with fishermen off of the Bay off the Chesapeake Bay and on some of the islands in the Bay. And what they were facing were really low fish counts and how difficult it was for them to kind of sustain their livelihood and support their families. So, and that was all because of rising sea levels, more warm waters, algal blooms. And that's when I was like, the environment and people are so connected, and This is so important. People's livelihood truly depends on this. So that's the kind of path I went down. In college, I took an environmental justice course, which really kind of, I think, reaffirmed the importance of environment, health, people, livelihood, and then just continue that journey through law school, and now I'm here.
Come on, talk about it. No, I mean, that's so important. The connection between environment and health, we can't ignore it. With everything that's happening right now, and the piece that you talked about of livelihood, affordability is such a key issue. And I think sometimes these themes get lost. People make climate change or environmental work about polar bears or the fish itself, but you don't think about, how all these things are interconnected. So that's really important. Suhani, thanks for that.
Yeah, absolutely.
So tonight we're talking about the Toxic Substance Control Act. We can also call it TSCA. What does this piece of legislation do?
Yeah, so I'm just going to call it TSCA.
Yes.
Saying Toxic Substance Control Act over and over again is just a lot. So TSCA is like a behemoth of a law. So this is our primary chemical safety law that we have in the U.S. So when you think about all of the things around you and all of like the chemicals and pieces and components that go into it, it goes through TSCA. There's some things that don't, like your like body products like lotions and body wash and makeup. That does not go through TSCA. That is run through a different program, as well as food packaging, and pesticides. That's all through a different program. But like this microphone, our phones, the paper, the table, everything that surrounds you is like it includes different chemicals, and all of that needs to go through TSCA to make sure that they're safe before they enter into our everyday lives. So it is so critical to protect the public from exposures that are quite literally surrounded by you everywhere.
So, okay, okay, let's just break it down really quick. So TSCA is a piece of legislation, but how does EPA come into play? Like, can you just give us the breakdown of like how the legislation actually creates these protections for us?
Yeah, so the Environmental Protection Agency is the agency that implements and oversees the Toxic Substance Control Act. And EPA has a responsibility and the authority to look at chemicals and make a determination that these chemicals that are being proposed to be put onto the market do not pose an unreasonable risk to human health or the environment before they enter into our homes, our workplaces, and everywhere that we go. So that is EPA's obligation right now under law as they look at new chemicals entering the market.
So, Suhani, how does TSCA protect public health?
Yeah, so TSCA does a number of things to protect public health. Kind of first and foremost is that unreasonable risk. No chemical can go through if the EPA recognizes or finds through their scientific assessments that there is a risk involved with the chemical that could potentially impact human health or the environment. This is especially important, and currently, as written in the law, there needs to be a consideration of vulnerable populations, and this includes communities that live near facilities, workers, children, pregnant women, and that's because these communities are often either more exposed to the chemical because they're working or they live near them, or because they're younger or older or pregnant or just more susceptible to the harms that are linked to these various chemicals that could go through.
Yeah, no, it's really important. And then, for our audience out there listening, this podcast is breaking down, the silos of what's happening in between environment and health and with these intergenerational conversations. And this is just something we can't ignore, because when we talk about health harms, especially for Black and Brown communities, we know we're hit worst and first. We're talking about how chemicals are, linked in their exposure, but you made a great point about being at the fence line, and we know that's a huge problem for Black and Brown communities.
Yeah, for a really long time, I worked in zoning, and where people live and where things are placed was a huge part of our work. So absolutely, the consideration of communities that kind of live on these outskirts of these polluting facilities or chemical factories, they're exposed more than the average public, so it's very important to consider that.
Yeah. So what are the most common chemicals under TSCA, and how do those show up in our lives?
Yeah, so there's a number of chemicals that go through TSCA. Some like kind of big ones that people think about are PFAS. That's been talked about over and over again in so many different ways. And PFAS is a huge problem. It lasts in our environment for a really long time. It lasts in our bodies for a really long time. And it's also found in so many products because it has a lot of characteristics that are in our goods, like anti-flammability, durability. So it's just found in a lot of things. But all PFAS chemicals have to go through TSCA before they enter the market. PFAS was found, years ago, and it went through TSCA, and many PFAS chemistries are right now in our market and in our products because they went through TSCA before it was reformed, actually. So there's kind of like this interesting aspect that so many PFAS chemistries are also grandfathered into our daily lives because they were passed before this major reform that happened in 2016.
Okay. And PFAS is also known as forever chemicals, right?
Yes.
Because they don't go anywhere.
They last for a very, very long time.
Wow. Okay. So as we're talking about how these chemicals show up in our lives, they have really technical terms, but they're everywhere. And like you were saying, TSCA, how people get exposed to these chemicals could be anywhere from how they're manufactured at the fence line, how they're found in our products. But there's some really, really bad chemicals that are out there. Can you talk a little bit more around phthalates and formaldehyde?
Yeah, and actually, you brought up a really good point on how chemicals are everywhere. And I just wanted to point that TSCA is one of those cradle to grave laws. So they consider a chemical from its production to where it's disposed. So like TSCA, it doesn't just look at like, oh, is your cell phone safe? It looks at every single chemical that's within your cell phone to ensure that it's safe. Not only when it's being produced in a chemical manufacturing site, but also when it is disposed of as e-waste and where that chemical could leach into your soils, your water, your air.
Wow.
So it's a very robust statute in a way that it looks at everything from start to finish. So consumer products is one of the spaces that, TSCA does consider how could this impact human health, because it's one of the uses that are often in existence. So phthalates is one of those chemicals that have gone through TSCA. It is relatively common. It's used in flooring or shower curtains, fragrance like products, cleaning products, air fresheners, also in kind of movable plastics like rubber ducks and children's toys and things that are kind of like that, like smushy plastic feeling. And phthalates are pretty dangerous. They have a number of health harms that are associated with them, including reduced sperm mobility, there's neurological harms, there's reproductive issues that are associated with phthalates. So it's a really dangerous chemical, and it's in a lot of products.
And same thing with formaldehyde. It's found in glues, adhesives, paints. And the important part, we're talking about TSCA as a piece of legislation. It gives EPA the authority to act and protect our health. And they have the pieces in place right now to already do it. But the industry, like we've been talking about, now they've got folks who've come from the chemical industry inside EPA. And these rollbacks is ultimately just going to impact our health in a really bad way.
Yeah, and it impacts it both ways. It's both, like I said, the discussion draft, it touches on both existing chemicals and new chemicals. So they're really making it difficult for EPA to regulate chemicals that are already on the market, like formaldehyde and vinyl chloride. And it limits their ability to put guardrails or ultimately ban it in certain uses. And then on the other hand, it also makes it really difficult for EPA to regulate and consider new chemicals that are trying to come onto the market. So it's kind of just like a cyclical problem that we're creating if we roll back this law. It makes it easier for new chemicals to get onto the market and harder to take off problematic ones that are already on the market.
Right. And we don't want to repeat the same mistakes as we've done before, right? Like you think about in the name of innovation, chemicals like PFAS or forever chemicals come onto the market. But now we're just now dealing or starting to deal with the impacts where it's $1 billion of cleanup, or we're just now understanding the long-term effects of these chemicals.
Yes. And that actually reminds me of another piece of this discussion draft where there's a part of it that states if a chemical is, let's say, marginally safer than one that's already onto the market, it's prioritized in the new chemicals process. And this is really dangerous. Like, it could be, if we're comparing like a super dangerous chemical that has like, let's say a 80% cancer risk that's already on the market, is marginally safer a 70% cancer risk? Like, do we still want a chemical that could cause cancer in 70% of instances of exposure? That's really dangerous. Like, marginally safer doesn't mean safe.
Right.
And I think that's something that, a lot of the industry likes to state, that we want to get safer chemicals out there. But no, we want to get safe chemicals out there.
Amen. Let's talk about it, Suhani. That's great. And so, we've been hearing a lot of updates in the media. I know some folks have been paying attention to this issue, especially when we talk about forever chemicals. It's a hot topic. And there's some things that are going on in Congress. And we're hearing that TSCA is in danger of some really serious rollbacks. So can you give us the rundown of what's happening? And can you share, what's at stake? What does this mean for people?
Yeah, I might give a little bit of like a long-winded history for a minute to kind of get to where we are today.
Let's do it.
Because I feel like there's like a lot to unpack within TSCA. So for a really long time, TSCA was passed like decades ago. And for a really long time, I think that there was really strong intentions behind this law of, there was nothing really looking at chemicals coming onto our market. So TSCA was passed. But the way that it was written decades ago, it didn't really give EPA the authority to really look at chemicals and regulate them. There was kind of like this like weird chicken and egg. Like EPA couldn't look at chemicals unless they thought they were unsafe, but you can't figure out if something's unsafe if you don't have data. So they weren't able to really look at chemicals in the robust way that we would really want our government to look at them. So a lot of chemicals ended up on the market for like 30, 40 years. And then this kind of all led up to 2016, which is when a major reform happened. And this reform took years and years in the making. Like there were heavy negotiations, a lot of different industries, health groups, communities, NGOs. We all came to the table to say we need to change this. Like there's just too many dangerous chemicals getting onto the market, including PFAS and things like formaldehyde, vinyl chloride, really dangerous chemicals. And there's this recognition that this needs to get changed. And finally in 2016, that change happened. It gave EPA the authority to look at chemicals and ensure that they don't pose an unreasonable risk to human health and the environment. They ensured that the EPA looks at chemicals that were grandfathered in, so they kind of prioritize these dangerous chemicals that are already on the market. And it was a massive reform, and it really is centered around public health and why this is important to protect our populations. What's happening now is, in the past 10 years in the making, is, okay, we have this massive reform, but there's a lot of requirements around that. Like, you need to submit data to ensure that EPA can actually look at the chemicals that they're reviewing, that they have robust data to make those determinations. And industry has kind of on the other side kind of stated that, like these chemical reviews are taking too long, or the process is too cumbersome, everything is delayed. So there's kind of been this like consistent, like, TSCA isn't actually as efficient as it's supposed to be. But one, I want to remind folks that TSCA isn't meant to be efficient. It's meant to protect public health.
Hello.
And two, a lot of those inefficiencies are actually on the industry side because they're holding up a lot of data or complaining about these regulations, or not regulations, but these guardrails that EPA suggests around their chemicals. Like, you have to wear PPE, you have to dispose of things properly. That's a cost to industry, and they don't want to do that. So that's why a lot of this back and forth happens. And the way sometimes we talk about it's like a homework assignment. Like you submit a paper and the teacher's like, you get a D. And then you're like, oh, no, hold on, let me go work on this again. You give it back. Okay, fine. You get a B minus, and you're like, wait, no, I don't even want that. So it's just this constant back and forth. But that's not how life works. Like you can't just keep asking for a regrade. So all of these are kind of like the stories that have accumulated to this point where now suddenly we're in this political moment where industry's like, let's just reopen the law again. Let's just roll back some of these hard-fought protections that we've had to, in the name of efficiency and innovation, to try and move our chemicals along quicker without as many checks. So that is what's at stake now.
Right. And this goes into this theme that we're seeing now with our new federal administration. They're trying to put profits over people and people's health. And to your point, it's not about being inefficient or, it's about protecting people's health, the concept of public health, which is really important. So give us the rundown. I mean, so you're saying there's these rollbacks that are happening in Congress. There's two kind of proposals that are out right now. There's one on the House side and there's one on the Senate side.
Yep. Yeah, so there's two discussion drafts currently in the works. Discussion drafts aren't formally introduced pieces of legislation just yet. They're kind of like working drafts, but they were both introduced in their respective committees on both the House and the Senate. And a lot of the themes, let's say, that are in these discussion drafts are rather similar. There's two major programs within TSCA right now. It's their new chemicals program and their existing chemicals program. It's exactly what it sounds like. The new chemicals program looks at new chemicals that are entering the market, and the existing chemicals program looks at chemicals that are already on the market and trying to kind of put guardrails and regulations around them to make sure that they're safe for use. The House bill attacks both of those sections pretty heavily. It minimizes a lot of the safety standards that were hard fought in 2016. So what it does is it raises the bar for what EPA has to prove in order to say that, oh, this chemical is risky. And I like to say that what this really does is it ties EPA's hands, and they're asking EPA to swim. It makes it very difficult for EPA to do their job, which is to protect public health. So they're really kind of reining in EPA's authority to be able to do the work that they're supposed to do. And the House bill, it cuts across 9 different sections of, or not the bill, the discussion draft. It cuts across 9 different sections of TSCA. So it really does gut a lot of these really, really important provisions that were, again, very hard fought for a really long time. On the Senate side, there's a very special focus on the new chemicals section. Again, does a lot of the minimizing the standard, makes it harder for EPA to do their job. And it also, some points in this discussion draft also really kind of allow industry to have their own science included. So there's a really significant weight that they provide to industry science, which, as you can imagine, is a little biased because it's their chemicals that they're trying to get across the finish line. So it's a little problematic in that sense. And unfortunately, the discussion drafts also really roll back protections for workers and fence line communities. Another thing the discussion drafts do is also pull back protections for workers and communities that are near facilities. For workers, they no longer consider like skin irritation or some chemical exposures or like burns to be considered to be an unreasonable risk anymore. So this is really problematic for workers because now you could have skin irritation or burns, and now that's no longer considered when they're trying to determine the safety of a chemical. So there's a lot of rollbacks on trying to protect our vulnerable populations.
Right. Yeah. And like you said, this is gutting our chemical safety law, and really nobody's asking for this except for the industry, which is the alarming part. But I want to take just a half step back because you mentioned vinyl chloride, chemicals like vinyl chloride. You also mentioned PFAS, and the important thing to know under TSCA is that with these proposed rollbacks, it's going to make it harder for EPA to regulate these chemicals in the future, right? And so we're thinking about, recently the 3rd year anniversary of the East Palestine trail derailment happened in Ohio. A serious, that was a serious chemical disaster where vinyl chloride spilled out of a train, and it contaminated a whole community. And when you think about these proposed legislations, it's going to make it harder for EPA to put protections on these moving forward, and that's unbelievable.
Yeah, and I think what's often forgotten is once the chemical enters the market, it's really hard to get it back out. Once the cat's out of the bag, it's out. How do you pick apart a chemical in a microphone and try and take it out, take out a certain chemistry? And this is across so many different consumer products. So it's really, really important to get it right first, which is why that safety standard is so important. So to weaken that, you're potentially putting chemicals onto the market that could be as dangerous as vinyl chloride, like Gen X, that's contaminated communities in the Cape Fear River. It's really dangerous. And then the cleanup costs are astronomical. This is increasing healthcare costs for people. It's millions of dollars in lawsuits. It's so much work, and people's lives are truly at risk once these chemicals are out.
Right. And so we have to think of this as an opportunity. So honey, why are these rollbacks being pushed right now? In the long term, how will this impact our communities? And how can we help people distinguish, between what's really happening and some of the misinformation that's out there?
Yeah, it's tough. I think right now there is a political moment, which is why this is being brought up. I think kind of given the current politics and the administration, there is a lot of appetite currently in the political atmosphere to change your chemicals law. And a lot of this is like in the name of like, again, innovation and efficiency. And I'll say that, you know, I think a lot of folks want innovative chemicals. We want to move forward in our society in a way that's, you know, technical and moving and progressive. But innovative chemicals are also safe chemicals. You can't have innovation without safety. They have to go hand in hand. So I would just, you know, as Tosca and the story around chemicals unpacks, you know, I think it's important to think that innovation is important, but that doesn't take away safety, which is the true fundamental, I think, like cornerstone of innovation.
Right. It can't be at the cost of our health. And to your point, you know, we're seeing new polling and data come out. You know, people want protections on chemicals. Nobody wants to be exposed to something that might link them to cancer or asthma or reproductive harm. Like these are, like you said, these chemicals are serious and they have really bad health effects. And the numbers don't lie. People don't want chemicals in their daily lives. So talk a little bit more about the industry influence. Like, you know, we're talking about who really is asking for this and who's pushing so hard.
Yeah, I mean, I think I'll say that back in 2016, I think there was a recognition that the law maybe wasn't functioning to the extent that a lot of folks would want it to. It wasn't really protecting public health to the full extent that the law was maybe meant to. And everyone was at the table at that time. There were community organizations, health organizations, the ENGOs, the chemical industry. Like we were all there because there had to be an overhaul. It's only been 10 years since 2016, which doesn't feel like, which may seem like a long time, but it truly isn't. You know, we've had 3 administrations, and the law kind of went back and forth on how it was interpreted. So there hasn't really been an opportunity for TSCA to really fully go into effect. I think there's a lot that still can be done with the current law, but I think what's important is that the fundamentals that were passed in 2016 are good bones. It's a good structure. We don't need to completely recreate the wheel here when we've created a good foundation. In this moment, it is just the chemical industry that's pushing it. And it's not just the chemical industry. It's a lot of like manufacturing industry and folks who rely on chemicals that are trying to push this, or produce chemicals that are trying to push this. And I would just say that this is also at a time where a lot of EPA officials that are in the chemicals office are also former chemical lobbyists. So there's kind of this like vested interest in both the administration and folks pushing this in Congress, where again, I think that there's just a little bit of a political opportunity that might be driving this push that's happening right now.
Yeah. So with that being said, you know, there's a lot of things swirling around, and sometimes it's hard to tell. You don't know what's the right information, what's truth, what could be, industry spin. How can we better tell the difference? How do we know what's real and what's not around, you know, what's happening with this piece of legislation?
Yeah, there's a lot in the space of chemicals. I think, one, it's always important to see where you're getting your facts from. There is a lot of misinformation around like how the administration is slowing down reviews. And I think I mentioned before that actually a lot of these processes are slowed down because there isn't really full transparency and communication between the industry and EPA. They're not giving full data sets. They're not providing the full breadth of data, or they're just not signing off on the guardrails that EPA wants them to put on their chemicals. So I think it's really important to look at TSCA in a holistic way. This isn't just about we need to speed up chemicals and our government isn't approving them quick enough for the sake of putting them into technology. This is, I think there's also a story of our government's working to protect public health, and they're taking those steps to do so. And I think that trying to say that suddenly this whole process needs to be rushed is really risky. But, EDF has put forward a number of resources, including some myths, facts around some of the industry talking points. So it kind of provides a different lens, I think, on how people view chemicals. So
Most
I hope
definitely.
folks maybe can look at that.
Yeah, for sure. We'll share our resources. And you mentioned this a little bit earlier, but we talked about the different changes in the legislation, well, the different changes in the administration, the legislation being out for a long time, and how, how does the back and forth from administration and how they interpret how these laws are supposed to be implemented, how does that affect our public health? And is there a way to make TSCA permanent?
Yeah, well, the pendulum that happens between administrations, I think, has been a real point of frustration, I think, for a lot of folks. Again, like since 2016, this new TSCA bill or the amendments that were passed, it's still relatively new. It's only been 3 administrations. However, during the first administration, it was a Trump administration. Second administration was Biden, and now we're back to Trump. And it's quite the difference in how they implement the law. And an example of that is formaldehyde. There's really sound science on how dangerous formaldehyde is. It causes cancer. There's no really like debunking this. Like the science has been around for a really long time. But this administration, I think there's the industry kind of influence that's been percolating within the TSCA team or the TSCA department, and there's a focus on, okay, what does industry want and how can we get our policies to get there, versus let's really look at the science and see if this is going to impact public health. And I think that really changes how these laws are implemented sometimes. Another example is phthalates. There were supposed to be regulations around phthalates for both consumer uses and worker protections. And now that has been pulled back to only consider worker protections and not consumer uses. So you can see the administration kind of narrowing how they're regulating these existing chemicals that are really dangerous.
So what would it take to strengthen TSCA rather than weaken it?
So right now, the TSCA office within EPA has very limited staff. They have almost entirely stripped away ORD, which is their independent research leg, and there's not a lot of scientists there that are able to undergo or be able to do scientific reviews. So I think what's most critical right now is ensuring that the administration stays funded and that they're fully staffed. You can't review chemicals or make determinations around the safety of chemicals if you don't have the staff to do it. So I think right now the most important thing is ensuring that the EPA stays funded and that they're fully staffed to be able to do their jobs to protect public health and our environment.
Most definitely, because science is real and it's important. And I mean, when we're talking about TSCA, they don't really need to reopen up the law and undo all these protections just to reauthorize the fees.
Yeah, so there's a fee reauthorization, and this is kind of a requirement where industry has to pay fees in order for their new chemicals to be reviewed. And a part of this funding goes back to the EPA and the new chemical section so they can continue the functionality of their office. This reauthorization sunsets every 10 years, but it's a pretty simple process. You can just pass a clean fee reauthorization to continue the fees. This isn't a look back requirement on like, oh, the fees are done. Let's just try and open up the whole enchilada again and see what's right and what's wrong. That's not what the reauthorization was meant for. So I think that, we could just come out of this with a clean reauthorization and still just continue to fund the office.
Right. We don't have to use a political moment to undo all these bedrock safety protections to do one small thing. Super important. So, as we come to the end of another amazing episode of the Green Agenda, we always like to leave with a call to action. How can communities, health professionals, or advocates like us make their voices heard and push back against the rollbacks on TSCA?
Yeah, so TSCA's a wonky law. It's not something that I feel like we think about every day. Like, I didn't know about TSCA until I went to law school in 2016. Like, I had no idea what this was. And the more I learn about it, the more I realize how important it is, quite literally, to our everyday lives.
Right.
It touches everything that's around us. So I think what's really important is one, to just like kind of think about everything around you, and that everything is made up of chemicals. I think for me, that recognition like made me feel like this actually really matters. And two, talk to your representatives.
Yes.
I think kind of raising this and reminding folks both in your community, your peers, your family, your representatives, that like TSCA matters. The things that I touch and surround myself with, that your children, your elderly parents and grandparents, your vulnerable worker population, they surround themselves with all of these chemicals, and it matters. So I think continuing the conversation from in all different spaces is really, really important.
Most definitely. Yeah, we talked about the majority of Americans don't want exposures to toxic chemicals. That doesn't matter which political party you may affiliate yourself, where you work, where you play. These issues are really important. And we mentioned earlier, there are some resources out there. There's myths and fact sheets talking about, how industry is trying to use this political moment to open up these laws. And we're stating the facts on how some things may not be true. But there's also some really important tools out there around transparency. EDF has what we call our Chemical Exposure Action Map, and it's a really cool resource where folks can go in. You can put in your congressional district, you can put in your zip code, or just drop a pin on the map, and you can take a look and see where chemical facilities or industrial facilities may be in your community. And you can look at which chemicals are being manufactured or processed there, and their links to cancer, asthma, or reproductive harm. And then even when you find that, knowledge is power. They always say that at Young, Gifted, and Green, but you can even take that a step further. On that tool, you can click the Take Action button, and it'll send a note to your member of Congress. It's really important to remember that we have the power. And it's our job to stand up for our health and for these important protections against toxic chemicals. So thanks again to Suhani for joining us today for Season 6, Episode 2 of the Green Agenda, and we'll see y'all next month.